First, let me start out by saying what a privilege it is to be here today, back in Washington. I regret to report that our weather in Austin is not much better than you have here today. Let me say thanks on behalf of the University of Texas for the invitation by INSA to join in this event. It's not a partnership that is familiar or natural to many of you, but I'll explain very briefly. Last October, down at the University of Texas, we hosted a conference, two-day conference, together with INSA on intelligence reform 10 years after the passage of the IRTPA. And it was a tremendous event, according to all the participants, many of whom are here today as well. We were able to bring together the current IC leadership, together with scholars, together with former leaders, together with our student population in Austin, and it was tremendously successful. We received great feedback, and so we're anxious to do some more of it. In that regard, I would invite any or all of you here, members of the Alliance, if you have particular ideas or programs that you'd like to pursue and you're looking for an academic partner, we intend to continue this partnership, and we think it can be active and helpful for the country and the community. Now, I was just told several minutes ago that it's my responsibility to introduce the panel today, and I'm happy to do that. It's a distinguished group, and fortunately for me, a very familiar one. So this will be very brief because all of these folks are quite familiar to you. So starting at the end, John McLaughlin, currently holding a chair at the Johns Hopkins Center for Advanced International Studies, formerly Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, Acting Director of Central Intelligence, Deputy Director of CIA for Intelligence, Vice Chairman of the NIC, and multiple other responsibilities. Also the founder of the Sherman Kent School of Intelligence Analysis, and my boss for 3 years. So anyway, we're delighted to have John here with us today. Next to John is Dr. Greg Treverton. Dr. Treverton, as you know, is the current chairman of the National Intelligence Council. He was previously the vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council some years ago, spent a great deal of time in academia and with the RAND Corporation, is really one of the authentic thought leaders and deep thinkers in intelligence today, and we're delighted to have you here today. Next to Dr. Treverton is Joan Dempsey, who truly requires no introduction to this crowd. I think most of your awards are either named after her or have been given to her over the years. Joan, of course, is the former Deputy Director of Central Intelligence for Community Management. She was also appointed by President Bush to be the Executive Director of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, the name of which we later changed. She's held a number of jobs as a civilian in the Department of Defense, and as I say, is well known as an expert and friend to this group. Next to Joan is my good friend David Shedd. David was liberated, as he reports, on Saturday. Was it noon or 11:59? After a distinguished career in U.S. intelligence. As many of you know, all of you know, David has been serving as the acting director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Before then, he served for 4 years with distinction as the deputy director of DIA. You heard from a distinguished panel earlier today of our former directors of national intelligence. Well, David was a partner in that project from the outset. He was Ambassador Negroponte's chief of staff, later the deputy DNI for resource plans and policy, if I remember the title correctly. And so David's a great friend and a great treasure to this community. Glad to have you here. On my immediate left is another individual who requires little introduction. This is General Hoss Cartwright, Marine General, former Marine aviator, currently holding the Harold Brown Chair in Defense Strategy at Georgetown University, also former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the only one on the group who's more of a customer of intelligence than a practitioner of intelligence, so we'll work that into our conversation as we move on. Now, Chuck and Joe assured me that I'd be given a few minutes to speak to intelligence reform myself, and I will decline that invitation and get right to the views of our panel that'll be of more interest to you. But I'll give you 5 bullets that capture my own experience with intelligence reform, and that started on the morning of 9/11 in the company of John McLaughlin. So the first thing that I always point out to groups speaking about the intelligence reform process over the last 10 years, is that intelligence reform in this country did not start in 2005, and it did not start in 2004. Rather, it started on that September morning on 2001. Everything changed that day. Our intelligence community responded to the threat, made the corrections that were necessary, and our nation's been safer ever since then. With respect to the IRTPA and the law that was passed and that Senator Collins described earlier today, I am someone who believes that our intelligence community can be more effective, provide more timely, more insightful, more accurate intelligence under the strong central leadership of a director in central intelligence. Excuse me, a director of national intelligence. It might also have worked as well under a director of central intelligence, but that's a different topic. Third point I'd offer to you is that I don't think that the benefits available to having strong central leadership in the intelligence community necessarily come at the cost or the expense of the individual agencies. And I think under the strong support and leadership of a director of national intelligence, agencies like my own Central Intelligence Agency can thrive and prosper in their specific disciplines. Now, it's been a difficult 10 years. I think Admiral Blair aptly summarized that in the earlier panel. It hasn't been an easy road for the ODNI to walk. But at the end of the day, I think the ODNI's best days and the best days for U.S. intelligence really do lie ahead of us. Two things I would direct people to focus on to ensure that we achieve those benefits. The first one is, frankly, joint duty. Many of you here will have an impression or some experience with joint duty. It seems to me absolutely essential that rising officers in the various intelligence agencies have the opportunity to serve outside their buildings, make friendships, make professional relationships, serve successfully on teams, and then when they rise to become the leaders of their agencies, that will be their natural instinct. And over time, just as Goldwater Nichols did for the Defense Department, I think we'll have a more integrated, more collaborative, effective community. And the last piece was also mentioned in the previous panel, and that's the importance of relationships and appointments. No future president of the United States needs my advice, but if I were to offer any, it would be to look at the team of people you're appointing to lead the intelligence community, to lead the national security community. That's at the Pentagon, that's at the State Department, that's at the White House, that's at Liberty Crossing, and even at Langley. It's more important than to have them work together as a team, to have them have trust, to have them want to go through difficult times together and understand each other's perspectives, than to have individually brilliant performers in each of those jobs. And I think that's well proven over the last decade. So with that, in terms of format, what we've decided to do, not unfamiliar to you, is go through the group, give everybody the opportunity to make some brief observations or comments focused on the future of intelligence reform, or specific specialties or interests that have transpired in the last 10 years. And then after that, I have a handful of questions, and then we'll get the floor open for your views. So with that, I think we've agreed General Cartwright is our opening speaker. So thanks so much, and let's get started.
Appreciate the opportunity, and obviously appreciate being here. It's a little bit like old home week here. The only thing was that we all kind of decided here on the panel that maybe we should be brought out in wheelchairs because we've been out of the practice for a long time. Not that we don't have strong opinions still, though. And as a customer, I try to be a good customer, demanding, want more, and it's never enough, and it's never good enough, and it's never fast enough and cheap enough, and all of the illities that go with that. I come this morning, freshly off of the National Defense Panel, which is a panel that's put together to look at the Quadrennial Defense Review in the Defense Department, and look at it from a standpoint of risk and a standpoint of, okay, what didn't we cover? And one of the key issues that we looked at, and my role there was to have a team, which was really a lot of fun for me, from several universities that looked at technologies, looked at capabilities, things that are coming, things that could be brought to the forefront, accelerated, et cetera, and entered into the capabilities that we have both on the intelligence side and the military side. And in doing that, and in reviewing the Quadrennial Defense Review, I don't know how accurate the number is, but we were told, basically, as we went through there, somebody did the counting, and 57 times, the answer to our problem was innovation. No more than that. It's kind of like saying cloud. It solves all problems, you know. If you could just do that, you'd solve all problems. And so the team that I put together and had was really to look at this issue of innovation and start to understand potentially where leverage is, where leverage might be, how to look at innovation from a standpoint of not just solving a problem, but all of the adjacencies, et cetera. If you look, for instance, at precision weapons, and you say, okay, if I'm in the Air Force, I would say that let me not have number of sorties per target, but number of targets per sortie. It was a huge leveraging activity. But the real leverage in it was we got rid of almost 60% of the Army's ground vehicles that were doing resupply of munitions forward, resupply of capabilities, and changed that game substantially. Those kinds of adjacencies are what you're looking for in innovation. And that was a little bit of what we were trying to understand is where's that leverage going to be? And part of it that we came to, which was one of those overall trends, was that we needed to broaden the base of the Department of Defense, of the intelligence organizations in the R&D scope. In other words, we had to broaden the capability, the opportunity for commercial activities, academic activities, to really contribute and bring forward the capabilities that they might be able to bring, small business, things like that, places where they're actually the hotbeds of innovation. How do we get them into the mainstream without having them go through much of what we have to go through to be a defense industrial base member, et cetera, part of the club and inside. And so a lot of the work that we did was trying to understand how we might be able to do that and where it would be particularly leveraging. The second insight was that this is not the age of the platform. It's the age of the information and the data. The art of war, the art of intelligence is in the data, not in the vehicles, okay? And if you have $1, the leverage in that dollar is going to probably be greatest if you put it towards the data, the information, the processing, the understanding, the art of analytics, the art of war, et cetera. It doesn't mean that we're not building platforms. It just means that the leverage in them is going to be in the data. It's kind of like in my day, I grew up, what was important about a car was that it had 4 on the floor, it had a big engine, a great transmission. Those were the things that were important. That's not what's important in cars today. Bluetooth is far more important than that. Okay? I mean, it's the reality. It's what sells. Okay? It is reflective of the age that we're in. And so I'm just in really broad strokes here. If you look at analytics in particular, starting to understand them, starting to do things with analytics that we never were able to do at scale, that we never were able to bring to bear because of the ability to process, the advances in processing power, the advances in storage, cloud architectures, the ability to move large amounts of data in quantities we never thought was going to be possible. Those things are bringing to fore new capabilities. They're changing the basic rules of data, though. They're changing the basic rules of analysis. It was, let me find a little thing that I think is a tell, that which indicates what might happen next. Maybe it's the elite. Maybe it's a certain individual, a leader, et cetera. And then focus in, put all the resolution we can on that particular issue, and out of that we'll have a better understanding potentially of what might happen in the future. That's kind of the opposite of where we are today. That's called elite decision theory. Where we are today is game theory. Look at everything. Don't get blindsided by the black swan. Look at the depth that's out there and then narrow down. That's a fundamental shift in architecture. A couple of architectures that we absolutely have to get after. The architecture in space. We've got to bring resilience to that. We've got to bring analytics to that architecture. We've got to figure out how we're going to do this. And key in that is, again, back to the first issue, commercial. Where in the commercial sector can we look and where can we get the leverage for cost reductions, capability improvements, fast turnover of knowledge, algorithms, et cetera? How does that fit? The DNI is doing a great job of starting to think their way through that. It is not without controversy. It is not without cultural pushback, but it is going on. All source is starting to actually mean something now. The ability to do it has not culturally found its way in yet, and there are technical hurdles, but we've got to keep pressing there. The same goes for undersea. We have to bring that same capability to undersea. How do we start to think about that? How do we get perspective on it? As a warfighter, I'm really happy with a few thousand meters of purview under the ocean. That really isn't enough. That's really not enough. We've got to start to think about how we understand it, how we pull the data together and find resolution, find a broadening of perspective apertures. In both those cases, space and sea, and in many others that you're familiar with, the third insight in the National Defense Panel anyway was automation, robotics, cognitive mobility. Thinking about how you can do that. Do I really have to put the best expert in the same physical location as the problem? And the answer is no. Okay? We've proven that in medicine now. We've proven that in military. We've proven it certainly in air. But it has to keep moving out. And how do you do that? And then how do you bring automation to those entities that are out there? I spend a lot of time in the academic world lecturing and working. And at Penn State, one of the areas that I love to work with is their engineering school, the robotics, the things that are associated with automobiles, and the algorithms that we're building to increase the safety and functionality and ability of automobiles to operate together. And then the functionality that comes from swarming technologies and how you move them and how you decide what is important to them and how you make them react to it to ensure that you don't lose perspective on a particular problem and that you can hand it off and move it across a swarm in ways that are hugely leveraging. Those kinds of technologies are in the commercial world. They turn over very rapidly, the new algorithms, the capabilities. They won't happen that quickly in the government world. We have to find a way to partner with that. I'll leave it at that.
It's terrific. Thank you, General. That may lead into what we discussed earlier. Joan, you want to take it away?
Sure.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Well, it's been 10 years since I left the government, and it's taken just about 10 years to get out of my head the daily slugfest and internecine warfare that went on inside the intelligence community. Now, the advantage of being outside, but closely aligned to the community still, is that I no longer see all of that if it's still occurring. And I'll trust that it's not, but I won't completely believe that it isn't. But what I see from a vantage point 10 years later is a lot that's working. Although the integration of the decade of integration, I see integration is a great slogan, it's also a reality. And why do I say that? How do I see that reality being manifested? We had centers, centers of excellence, centers of intelligence prior to the reform legislation, but it's really been in the intervening years after 9/11 that the centers have gained ground. They've become an extremely important component of intelligence integration. And I see a lot of promise in that. Steve mentioned the need to continue to have a robust rotational structure inside the community, and I agree that that's incredibly important, and the importance of relationships. At the senior levels in particular, the intelligence community works or it doesn't work based on the strength of those relationships. And the more that we can drive those relationships into and among the various elements of the community, the better off we'll all be. I see an awful lot to be optimistic about in terms of how intelligence is functioning today in spite of a couple of years of difficult reductions in budgets. And I think that's all to the positive. I think it also begins to allow a sort of environment that Haas Cartwright started to describe. One of the most exciting things that I see being unleashed today inside the intelligence community, albeit in very small steps, is this notion of using data science, using data analysis to augment our more traditional types of analysis that have served us so well. So having data arrayed in a cloud where you can get at it and do analysis of the data itself, taking the deductive reasoning that we have perfected over decades of the way we do analysis inside the intelligence community, that contextual hypotheses-driven analysis, Combine it with data scientists who can do analysis on the data itself, pattern analysis, use quantum amounts of data when they all get arrayed properly and can be brought to bear, and augment with inductive reasoning that deductive analysis that we've done so well. Combine that with computer capabilities that make that analysis available broadly is a pretty exciting future to contemplate for the community. I mean, that will unleash the power of information in a fundamentally different way than we've been able to do it in the past. Now, the big challenge, and Haas mentioned this, is scaling that mixture, that combination of our deductive analysts who understand the context and the hypotheses with the inductive analysts who can use the data, mathematics really, to bring data to bear, and combine that with the kind of computer tools and technology we need to make it available to the entirety of our analytic community. That's a scaling issue that is going to be something that we're going to have to deal with over the next few years. But the power of it is pretty extraordinary in my mind. I think integration has been key, integration at all levels in the way the organizations interact with each other, but also bringing data together in an integrated fashion has been the requirement. It's been the criteria for allowing us now to go out and use data differently to actually inform and develop knowledge in a way that we fundamentally have not been able to do in the past. So I'm actually pretty excited, Steve. I think there's a lot to look forward to in the way the community is integrated today, the way it's operating, and so I'm bullish on the IC and our future.
All right, thanks for that, Tony. John, would you mind going next?
Sure. I'm thinking about three things now as we look forward in the intelligence community over the next 10, 15 years. One of them is how do we continue to add value to what the customer receives at the level to which the customer has become accustomed and has the right to demand? Why do I think that's going to become more challenging? I think it's primarily because, having been out about 10 years myself now and fully integrated into the outside world and the information explosion that's going on there, it's not too hard to figure things out these days. You know, these little things we carry in our pockets here, we could all, if we just went silent for the next 15 minutes, we could kind of figure out what's going on in major parts of the world at a certain level. And so I think the challenge for intelligence is going to get harder, particularly on what we have traditionally called the hard targets issue. That is, getting things that are now hard to get, always have been hard to get. You know, if you're trying to get stuff on the Chinese Politburo, you're up against the fact that they don't use electronic communications. They write things down and they drive everything around in trucks. So it's a challenge that's heavy, and the customer will want things that add value. It goes a bit to what General Cartwright was saying a few minutes ago, I think, about the importance of data. Data will become very, very important. So on something like Iran, people will quickly figure out what their broad strategy is, but the questions will be, as they are today, well, how many kilograms of enriched material do they have? How long will it take them to turn that into a weapon? Just staying with that issue for a minute. And beyond that, are they doing anything covertly that we should know about? And we've been successful on that score in the past, but that kind of intelligence question will become more prominent and, I think, harder to answer in the out years. That's a challenge. And a second thing relates to that in a way, and that has to do with this, that an iron rule of intelligence when it comes to technology has always been that your technology has to be better than everything that's available commercially because the adversary has all of that. So we're in the midst of, you know, our lifetimes are short, so it's easy to say we're in the midst of the greatest technological revolution in history. I suppose if you were around when people discovered fire or the wheel, it would seem that way too. But I think there's something fundamentally different about what we're going through now. A lot of it has to do with miniaturization of circuitry. Again, this thing, if you went back to the late 80s, when we started finding that early 90s when we started using these phones and things, there were about, I think, 29,000 transistors in a microprocessor. Now there are over 1 billion. And I work today with some engineers in a consulting role, not that I'm one, but I provide the intelligence perspective. And I often ask them, are we at the level, are we at the end of the possibility of miniaturization? Can things get smaller and more robust? They tell me, no, we're not at that limit yet. It may be possible in out years that you would have the computing power here in something the width of several human hairs. Well, you know, as an intelligence officer, I'm thinking, remember Bob Gates once said, an intelligence officer who's someone who sees flowers and thinks of coffins. So when I, you know, when I hear that, I say to myself, well, what could an evil mind do with that? If we're worried about things like bioweapons and so forth, what could an evil mind do with the kinds of technology that we're going to see in the out years? Third thing I would mention is this, and this is kind of a tricky one, because again, it goes back to something General Cartwright was saying, I think, and that is, we are going to have to break out of the traditional suite of collection techniques that we have become accustomed to. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you know, up to the invention of the telegraph, HUMINT was it. Yes, people opened others' mail and so forth, but we didn't. It was only when we started to move information electronically in the middle of the 19th century that the requirement was there to collect things technically. And on that foundation, we've built SIGINT, later imagery, the whole suite of MASINT collection techniques. That's the way we think about collection. We will have to ask, and we're becoming routinized on that, I think. It hasn't always been that way. Periodically, someone has asked what was once called the paradigm shift question, which is this: what is it that if we could do it, what is it that if we could do it would revolutionize what we do? Isn't that what people asked in the late 50s when someone said, hey, what if we could take photographs from space? Now, you say that to an audience of young students like I teach today, and this is the Google Earth generation. They're not impressed. But those of you who were around then know that that was a striking and challenging idea and question then, and then we did it. So asking that question now in the out years is going to be very important for intelligence. What is it that if we could do it would revolutionize what we do? And I think if we ask it and answer it imaginatively, it will go beyond SIGINT, imagery, MASINT, or at least it will break new frontiers in those disciplines, which are basically about watching, listening, and sensing. So I'll stop there. That's just three things that are kind of on my mind as I think about the out years in this great profession that we all share.
Terrific. Thank you, John. Dr. Treverton?
Oh, thanks, Steve. I suppose we run the danger of being in famous agreement up here. I don't want to push that along, but as I look out and think about the future of intelligence, what strikes me is increasing transparency in which we'll have to operate. Sometimes it seems to me we're like the Roadrunner cartoons you remember, where Roadrunner would run off the cliff and not start to fall till he looked down. Sometimes I think we're off the cliff and haven't quite looked down yet. If you put together biometrics, facial recognition, cell phones, ubiquitous cameras, the fact that your car has 12 distinct emitters, it is becoming a very transparent world, and that's going to have big implications, I think, obviously for cover, but also for how we think about our business in general. We're close to the point where our policy clients are going to want 24/7 conversations with intelligence on their iPad. We're already at the point where the young people we want to attract chafe at being less well connected inside than they are outside, and that's got to get fixed. It simply has to get fixed. So there'll be really big challenges, I think, out there to how we think about the business, who we hire, how we train them. Increasingly, it seems to me the community that's thought about quality control through papers is going to have to get used to quality control through people. We're going to have to empower people to have those 24/7 conversations and just trust that they'll do it well. We already do that in some areas. My National Intelligence Council, I want my national intelligence officers to be out there talking all the time, and the PDB briefers are another nice example. Beyond how we change how we do our business, I think of transparency as a great opportunity. From my perspective, the traditional intelligence cycle, which we all know is something of a fiction, is really very unhelpful. It's a sort of industrial processing model where we set requirements, we collect against requirements, we then analyze against what we've collected, then we disseminate the results. Or as one waggish analyst I talked to said, it's collect, write, publish, repeat. Well, that may not have been a bad approach to intelligence during the Cold War, when we had one known target and we were trying to collect in an information-scarce environment. It seems to me it can't be right now where information is ubiquitous. Here I pick up points that the General and Joan made. Information is everywhere. It's the data that matters, and it's ubiquitous. In any effort at doing analysis, we're only going to use a very small amount of the data that's out there, and so our focus on collection seems to me to be necessary in some areas, but broadly misplaced. To think that collection is the source. Notice now when we identify a gap in analysis, we always say, what's the collection gap? As though we could go out and collect something and fix it. Sometimes I think the right thought of gaps is thought gaps. What are we not thinking about that we should have been, since we're not going to collect everything that's out there in any case. It's also going to be the case that we're not going to know exactly what we're looking for all the time. And we may find the answer before we know the question. Joan and others have emphasized the importance of being able to search that data out there. It does take us very much into big data with all the challenges that poses. But I think it's also exciting because it opens up the possibility of learning the answer before we know the question, of trying to add some shape to what is a very shapeless world, and at least of trying to open up thoughts by analysts and others to new possibilities through looking not at causation, but at correlation. And we're going to get lots of spurious correlations, to be sure, but some of them will be interesting. I doubt that for the future I can foresee, they'll be determinative. We'd like to get warning from big data. That seems to me is going to be elusive. But at least we'll be able to get tips. Maybe take a look at this. Take a look at this set of factors, or maybe look at that. In that sense, I'm excited about the possibilities that operating in a much more transparent world imply.
Thanks, terrific. David, take us into questions.
Thanks, Steve. One of the advantages that one has being last is to say yes to everything else that was said to my right and left and doing sweep up. But let me build on certainly Haas Cartwright's portion in particular in terms of operationalizing some of what he was saying. Drawing from the 4.5 years that I experienced at DIA as someone who never served in uniform, but then becoming intimately familiar with the military services and so forth as a result of the mission at the Defense Intelligence Agency. And here's my observation to the question that occasionally was asked of me during my tenure there, is what are the lessons learned from the previous decade, essentially the last 10 years, pertaining to two active wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And my takeaway there is actually intimately associated, tied into, and inextricably linked to intelligence reform. And that is operationalizing intelligence, the big data that Joan talked about, the issues that both Greg and John mentioned as well, to the operator. That is, in the vernacular of the military services, into your operational J3s and into your planning. And I find as somewhat of a critic, we are somehow lost up on the hill, oftentimes between distinctions of Title 10 and Title 50. And what it does is actually bring artificial divides to how that intelligence is used inside these two communities of uniform and civilian, DoD and intelligence community. And I think while progress has been made quite dramatically, as I think of the fusion of intelligence that allowed us to get to an individual like Zarqawi in Iraq, we have not gone far enough. When I think of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, I think that data needs to be far more integrated into both communities by way of, again, operationalizing it. Because the great lesson of the previous decade has been the closer you bring the intelligence collector and analysts to those who have to execute to the shortest amount of time, the more effective you're going to be in countering the adversary. Whether it's your traditional state actor adversary, as we see the mounting crises around the world, or your non-traditional ones or non-state actors, as we see with ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and so forth. So that's my key observation. And I think that bringing the USDI and the DNI much closer into proximity with the authority, direction, and control vested in the Undersecretary for Intelligence, in the case of the current one, Mike Vickers, from the Secretary, bringing those two communities closer together. What's interesting, part of the critique that I witnessed at DoD is that there were elements of DoD that felt that the intelligence community in general and CIA in particular had taken over DoD. Well, that's an interesting observation. When you go up the river to Langley, it was, what has happened here? DoD has taken over CIA. Again, a very interesting observation. The point here is it is not a zero-sum game. It is actually very positive to bring these two communities together, and I think in defense of the nation, we are much better off for it. My second very brief observation, and it's building on the comment about joint duty. You know I'm an ardent supporter of it, having been on joint duty for approximately 14 years. So I think I might take the record, as of 3 days ago when I left government, for joint duty. I am a proponent in the future of doing something that, John, I think we can attribute to you in creating a senior executive service line of operation for analysts who never wanted to go into management, but you could certainly take their subject matter expertise and really reward it by making them senior managers. I'm going to borrow an acronym, which obviously would have to be replaced, not by whom I'm borrowing it from, but by someone else, but creating an NIO for the community leadership, a National Intelligence Officer. So I am only borrowing it to reflect not a member of the NIC, but someone that in fact is in a cadre of leadership that is built across a career of joint duty, that is groomed for the leadership of agencies at its first, second, and third echelons. And I truly believe that will have one of the greatest impacts. I would not go to legislation. I would not go to EO 12333 for that. I would go to the core leadership, current and in the future of the intelligence community to achieve that. Again, bringing together two critical parties in that being the Director of National Intelligence and the Undersecretary for Intelligence in creating that. I look forward to the questions.
Terrific, thanks. Yeah, I have my studiously prepared list of provocative questions here, but we're running a little short on time, so maybe while some of the folks jot down questions and look for a microphone, let me ask Joan to say a word briefly about the intelligence industrial base. I mean, that's largely the group we're speaking with today. Nobody's more expert in this than Joan. There are budget dimensions to this. There are issues of reputation and standing in the aftermath of the Snowden revelations. Lots of people want to point at contracting as vulnerability for our community. I think that's not the right answer, but I'd like you to explain to us how you see it right now.
Sure, thanks,
How healthy
Steve.
is it?
Yeah, well, everybody in this room could probably answer this question as well or better than me. I think the industry has been through a number of years of fairly difficult time trying to resize itself in reflection of the budget reductions and some of the other pressures. We've seen it most directly in this decade, and I've had the unfortunate experience of living through the up and down budget cycles for about 40 years now, and those cycles last almost a decade in every case. They follow, we have a lot of spending followed by a lot of reductions, and we never seem to learn how to do either the increases or the decreases well, or deal with the aftermath. But this time around, what we're seeing, unlike in the 90s, where we had a much smaller industrial base and was really around information technology and platform development, we're seeing the changes in the services industry. We saw it this week with the acquisition of Cytor by SAIC that's just begun. And that compression, of course, is in response to the budget reductions. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it is what it is, but there are probably ways that the government could have acted to make those reductions and make the results a little better. It seems to me sometimes that the government does not see the government-industry partnership as a true partnership. It sees it more along the lines of a necessary evil. Having been out and seen what industry brings to the intelligence community in particular, but the government generally, I think there needs to be a stronger and better partnership. And I think we have the opportunity now that the budgets have somewhat stabilized and hopefully will be more stable going forward to create a better partnership. But the industry has downsized. It's consolidating again around the services side. We're all trying to become leaner and operate more efficiently, and that's how we're dealing with what's going on. I would tell my government colleagues here that the thing that we could value most, even maybe more than budget increases, is stability in the procurement process. Having to deal with constant surprises in how the government acquires services and capabilities has really caused a lot of permutations inside the industry that are unfortunate in the way that we support back to our clients. So better this year than last year, but still some, I think, challenging years ahead for the industry as we resize and retool to be that essential partner.
Thank you, Joan, for those observations. Microphones, questions? I see a hand up. Randy Fort, is that you?
Yes, Randy Fort with Raytheon. Thanks, Steve. Good to see you again. So the panel in your comments touched on some of the technology things that are happening, and in fact, there's a lot of others. Holographic computing, which Microsoft just announced and rolled out. We have the Internet of Things, 3D printing, exascale computing coming on the scene, and so forth. And yet we're looking at all these technologies from an intelligence community that has a 1950s sort of organizational structure, more or less. Most of those agencies having sort of come about in the 50s and 60s, and we've been kind of riding that wave now for more than half a century. So to the panel, is that really the optimum organizational construct for leveraging, using those technologies going forward? Do we have the right organization, or should we be looking at some new constructs to take advantage and leverage those technologies?
I'd like to pick that one up.
I'll do an intro and then let somebody jump on that really knows what they're talking about. This transition that we're going through, Randy, is one that is disruptive. And anytime there's disruptive technologies that are introduced, it's the cultural transition that is the longest and most problematic. I'm looking here, and so I'm going to pick on my good friends at IBM. But it's like the stages of mourning. First, we're in denial. There's no way this stuff can really be as good as people say. Then we go into competing with it, and that's where we are today. We're trying to compete with it. So if I look back at Big Blue and chess players, then Watson and Jeopardy. Now, what's interesting is now Watson is moving into business and understanding and moving. And so what we're trying to do here is, whether you look at organizational structures, is the ability to harness with the maximum efficiency is a cultural dynamic and change. And organizational structures take time. And initially we're going to be in denial. Initially we're going to try to compete with the technology. And then we start to partner with it. And partnering is where the nirvana, where the leverage really starts to come. And I would say in the next 3 to 5 years that partnering will be the theme. How do you partner? What's the role of man? What's the role of computational power or machines? And how do we best partner with them, not compete with them? But until we get to that point, organizational structure will mirror what we did before. And that's where we find ourselves. It may be just changing names and deck chairs, but quite frankly, it'll be far more efficient as we start to get a real, true understanding of how to partner.
Follow up on that?
Yeah, I would simply add that I place great confidence and hope in the younger generations to bring this in. Guys like myself will resist the change because, as our good friend Mike McConnell often said, bureaucracies will choose failure over change, over and over again. And so it's the younger generation that will see with that massive amount of data that they simply cannot find the needles in the needle stack, let alone the haystack, that will drive them to embrace the technologies. It's far less about the community, in answer to your question, Randy, about the community's design, as much as the culture, what I call the mindset of resistance, that not invented here, best done if only done here. The fact is that the government has, by and large, lost its oligopoly control of technology, to not call it monopoly on it, in terms of the technology on the edge. And so at some point, we will move to that third stage. I see that as a generational change as well. My prayer and hope is that it's not in front of a commission explaining why we didn't go where we needed to go before the events that have us in front of that commission.
Great. Did you have a response to that?
I was just going to say two things. One is it was looking at the intelligence community that led me to formulate my first rule of organization, which is that any organization is better than any reorganization.
Fair enough.
That said, if we were going to start over, would we organize the intelligence community around sources? I doubt it. It made a lot of sense in the 1950s, as you say, Randy. It may not make so much sense now. The challenge is that the main alternative, which is organizing around missions or tasks or centers, has its own liabilities. Tends to enshrine a very short-term look. We see that with NCTC. And it also is not clear that it would help with this ability to get technology, partly because of the short-term view. It's not clear it would be better and might be worse in terms of trying to pull in and make use of rapidly moving technology.
Greg, may I ask you one of my follow-up questions on this that I'd reserved for you was the issue of social networks and social media out there. My own experience, serving in the Middle East during the Arab Spring revolutions and the criticism the intelligence community absorbed at that time for not being prescient enough, not being modern enough, not monitoring the correct networks to know what these people in the streets were doing. I think it was a little bit unfair and it's a little bit simplistic, but you've written on this, and so how close are we, or what challenges stand between us and really a useful exploitation of this massive social media that's out there, and that I think probably informs some of the problems that we have, some of the decisions that we have to make in government. But we seem to not be there yet, and I'd be curious your thoughts on how we get there and what we have to overcome.
No, it's a very good question. I think we're actually making progress. When I looked at this 5 or 6 years ago, I didn't expect to find much exploitation. What I found most interesting then was mostly on the targeting side, not on the exploitation of social media, using social media to target particular people. And that was pretty interesting and innovative. My quip at the time was, in all cases, it was a often young but always technologically savvy officer that spent the first 5 months trying to convince his or her superior that it was work, not play, and then the next 5 months trying to convince the lawyers that it was legal. So it was a hard uphill road, and we still have a lot of those problems. But I think on the analytics side, we are making quite a lot of progress. There's the IRTPA program on open source indicators. I share your sense that a lot of the criticism for not monitoring stuff during Arab Spring was a bit unfair. Because one thing we know is that stuff is huge in volume and very unreliable. So it means that we need lots of ways of, again, correlating, filters. I think we're beginning to get there. So I'm confident that we'll at least get to, as I suggested earlier, the point of being able to provide some tips. Maybe look here, maybe think about this, or maybe think, if you see this, maybe this is a suggestion that something else that you wouldn't expect is going to happen.
Right. It's terrific. Yeah, I'm mindful of the thought as I watch the Russian forces move into eastern Ukraine, a country I formerly served in, of the fact that all 15 or 20,000 of those forces are probably carrying handheld devices with them.
As one of our colleagues says, selfies are our best friend.
Exactly right. And so I think there's something here, and I'm encouraged by what you say about our ability to exploit it. Questions? Others? Please.
Joe Manzifo, the question I've got is, if the IC were to run like the open Moneyball, there seems to be a lack of data and metrics for the articulation of all the success and things that go well. How well are we at actually measuring what we do and where we ought to be going with parts one on the idea of metrics for performance?
John, do you have a thought on that? I suspect you do.
Well, you know, I'm someone who once wrote a note to our workforce after we'd been accused of some failures, simply saying in the note, get over it. Again, to quote Bob Gates, when asked if they would ever abolish the CIA, he said, of course not. There'd be no one left to blame. So this is just something that comes with our business, I think, and publicizing the successes is simply hard, in part because, you know, if you look at what are the successes, well, some of them are fairly obvious. You know, one could say taking down the AQCON nuclear proliferation network, discovering the covert uranium enrichment program of North Korea, similarly in Iran and so forth. There are certain things, figuring out that there was a nuclear facility in the desert in Syria, which the Israelis graciously removed. So, I mean, there are successes that are fairly obvious. We don't trumpet them, but they're fairly obvious. The hard part is the successes that often matter the most are successes that occur when nothing happens. You know, I make a phone call, or one of these folks makes a phone call to a Deputy Secretary of State. This is a real case, saying we know there's going to be an attack on an embassy in the Middle East. That embassy is evacuated. We take down the plot. No one ever knows about that. So sometimes when things don't happen, the other problem with successes is that often intelligence successes are simply woven into the fabric of a successful policy. The Balkans, for example. One can say the Balkans is not over, it never is, you know, generates more history than can be consumed locally, all of that. But nonetheless, the Balkans are at peace today, and there were the Dayton Accords and so forth. Well, intelligence was just woven into everything the US government did that brought the Balkan problem from the mess it was in the 90s to a peaceful outcome. So I think this is hard to do, hard to explain. The phrase policy failure is seldom heard. The phrase intelligence failure is just part of the lexicon. So I'm not being defeatist on this, but I'm saying I don't think we should obsess about it. Our successes are obvious when they are obvious, and when they're not, we have to take some comfort in the fact that we're a lot more, well, let me quote a friend of mine, Tom Fingar. Tom once said something that stuck with me, and that is that on our very best day, we are not as good as we need to be. And on our very worst day, we're not as bad as everyone thinks we are. Another way to think about this is whether you think of intelligence as basketball or baseball, okay? In basketball, you've got to hit 85, 90% of your foul shots or you're out. In baseball, you can get into the All-Star game with a 300 batting average. So where do you want to be on that spectrum? Well, you want to be over toward 90%, but in a business that's riddled with deception and an adversary that's resisting you, it's mathematically certain you will not get to 100%. So these are things that could be said to a public to help them understand how to think about, this is something I do in my graduate teaching now, help people think about success and failure in intelligence. And I'd be all in favor of that, more public discourse on the nature of intelligence and what determines success and failure.
Thank you, John. We'll give General Cartwright, our customer, the last word on metrics, how we're doing.
I worry about this because, at least on the DoD side, we have operational research analysts, ORSAs, that we really rely on to go out and tell us what's working and what's not working. And the institution itself does not want to know that. They'd rather fail than know what works versus what doesn't work. Because if it doesn't work in a particular situation, we assume that it never works. And we miss that. And we in the military, absolutely have to have that, and it's equally so in the intelligence community. We have to have organizations that we can rely on to actually go into the data and find out what is working and what is not, to focus on those areas that give us advantage. And we don't like to hear that news sometimes. It's very difficult. So whether these organizations need to be directly embedded or they become part of something else. We've used IGs to do this in the past. We've used various organizations to do it. But as soon as conflict goes away, we try to get rid of those people. Okay? And then everything that we have is the most important thing that we have. And we can't really understand where we're getting our leverage. And this kept happening in the last 15 years of my experience. How do you use full motion video? How long do you have to look at something to understand it? Those kinds of insights fundamentally changed tactics, but they didn't come without a huge cultural bias against knowing that. And it's very difficult. And so, as leaders and prospective leaders, the key is to try to make sure that you understand that you have to find these insights. They will not be brought to you, number one. And number two, back to the data. The data, you have to look at it, you have to understand it. It's very easy to look at the data and it comes with an insight and have a commander say, yeah, but you don't understand the context. Come on. I mean, time and time again, it's telling me this is what made and closed the firing loop, or this is what gave us the insight. Okay, and this is how it gave us the insight, how we use that particular phenomenology. If you can't get that information, we're going to be hugely disadvantaged. And we'll be very happy about it, but we will be hugely disadvantaged.
Steve, if I could I just add something
Please,
to
John,
what I
sure.
said?
Yeah.
Going back to my comments on success and failure, I don't want to leave you with the impression that I'm saying failure doesn't matter. In fact, what I want to say is that when failures occur, it's imperative that the intelligence community go to school on them, and we have. I would say the last dozen years has been an intensely introspective time in intelligence, looking back at a couple of major failures we had. The result has been salutary in the sense that lessons have been learned and applied. So when I said to the workforce, get over it, I meant get over wringing your hands, don't have morale problems. What you have to do when you make a mistake is stare it in the face, figure out what went wrong, take corrective action, and move on.
And there are many examples of that. Thanks, John. Please join me in thanking our panel.